Hello and welcome back to the second episode of the Civic Podcast, where me and Markus talk about the stories in politics, economics, law and society that are shaping our world. Markus, welcome back. Episode 2. How are you feeling?
Thanks, David. Feeling good about the feedback we've received for the first episode with Steve Laddick a couple of weeks ago. Not feeling so great about the state of affairs, as we'll talk about today on the podcast with David Luban, also from Georgetown University. But it's disconcerting news when we see what's happening with lawyers and the law in the U.S. at this point, and there's increasing amounts of pressure coming to bear on both the profession and the institutions from the Trump administration at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. As a legal professional myself, I'm really interested and worried about what's happening in the US and the way lawyers and the legal profession are being targeted there by the Trump administration. Really interested to sit down with David Luban in a moment and hear his thoughts on the issue. It is a little grim, isn't it, Markus? I got to say, I enjoy spending the time with you, but this is one of the more grim 2 hours in my week.
Well, I'm as a German, I will say, well, that's what you get when you talk to a German. But no, honestly, it is grim. And when we do the prep for the episodes, I continue to be amazed, although I probably shouldn't be anymore. I continue to be amazed how bad it is. And when I first contacted David Luban, who I knew beforehand, he said it's worse than you think it is, and what we will see is that it is worse than it is once you start to dig underneath, and that's exactly why we chose this topic. Again, in line with what the podcast is trying to do, is rather than chasing every single bit of information, is to start to think about the larger implications of this Trump policy of targeting lawyers and large law firms and essentially chilling the legal profession from bringing even lawsuits against the administration, which is sometimes what lawyers do, and without fear or reprisal. But that's exactly what's not happening in the U.S. anymore, and that's very disconcerting, also as a signal into other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking there about the executive order that was only just published about effectively about revenge against law firms that choose to bring or are instructed to bring litigation against the federal government by their clients. It's pretty extraordinary stuff. Well, without further ado, let's get into it. Let's welcome David Luban to the show. Our guest today on the Civic Podcast is David Luban, a university professor and professor of law and philosophy at Georgetown Law School. Since 2013, he's also served as the Class of 1984 Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the US Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. And David's research interests center on moral and legal responsibility in organizational settings, including law firms, government, and the military, which is apt for our conversation with him today. In addition to legal ethics, he writes on international criminal law, national security, and just war theory. His most recent book is a book on the moral and legal philosophy of Hannah Arendt. David, thank you so much for joining us today on the Civic Podcast.
It's a pleasure. It's been far too long since I've been back in Australia.
Well, we're glad to have you here, albeit virtually. And you, in addition to that luminous CV that I just read out for you, you also have a bit of history with Markus.
Yes, Markus and I met when we were both at Stanford. I was a visiting professor. He was doing advanced graduate work, and he was my research assistant on international criminal law topics. And then we kept in touch afterwards. I can't remember if it was the next year or the following year, did this amazing bicycle trip from Germany to the China Sea.
Seems like a lifetime ago now, but yes.
Wow.
Thanks for bringing that up, David.
That is... can we talk about that instead? That sounds really exciting.
Might be a bit of a one-sided conversation, but I think we have something else to talk about.
We do. We've got a conversation planned today, as we said at the top of the episode, about the Trump administration's conflicts with the legal profession, with lawyers in the executive, in Congress, and in the judiciary. Markus, start us off here a little bit. We're talking about some pretty extraordinary stories of the Trump administration's influence over the private legal profession, but how do these lawyers in various different roles in government and in the private profession that the Trump administration is targeting sort of all fit together?
So I thought we'd start off with a bit of a sort of, I guess, a theory of what's actually happening in the grander scheme of things, which is, to my mind at least, that Trump clearly has the executive in his own hand. He very much sort of is the epitome of the sort of unitary executive theory, if ever there was one, and in the executive, I think we see the removal or diminishing of the role of lawyers in a range of areas. We've seen the JACs, civil rights branches in various government agencies, in Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, federal prosecutors, and so on. The next bit, I think, is Congress, where at least so far he has a reasonable amount of control over most members of Congress. TBD, how long that will last, and for our listeners might go back to our previous episode with David's colleague, Steve Vladek, where we talked about that part as well. And then I think what we now see is this, what I would call a two-pronged attack on the third branch of government, the judiciary. Number one, the judiciary itself, and then the lawyers. And we've seen this with this order and continued fight by Judge Boasberg of the Federal District Court in Washington, which we might get tangentially into, where the plaintiff sought a pause to the deportation of a group of migrants, many of whom received little or no due process. And administration officials then clearly said that most of the migrants were from Venezuela and that all of them were affiliated with gangs, highly disputed. And then, of course, Mr. Trump calls Boasberg out to be impeached, arguing on social media that if a president doesn't have the right to throw murderers and other criminals out of our country because a radical left lunatic judge wants to assume the role of president, then our country is in very big trouble and destined to fail. Well, leave aside that Judge Boasberg was, I think, the head of the FISA court. David can say more about this. So has, for all intents and purposes, dealt with national security issues for a long time. But then we get to the law firms, and this is sort of our topic for today. So David can say whether I'm completely wrong about this, that I think there's sort of a bigger element here, namely executive, Congress, and judiciary sort of in one subjugating it or usurping more power than at least the Constitution would otherwise give. So, David, over to you maybe for an initial comment.
Yeah, I would put it in an even broader context. But let me start with just the branches of government. One of the things that's been striking about the Trump administration is that the president's party controls both houses of Congress. So ordinarily, a president with an ambitious agenda with that kind of political control would be asking Congress to legislate all of his prerogatives and priorities. He isn't doing that. Instead, he's doing it all by executive orders. Which is a backhanded way of saying this is all presidential prerogative. This is an anti-parliamentary move. I mean, the fact that the Congress has been completely supine in the face of this is probably because of the fact that the majorities of both houses are the president's party. But they are collaborating with the diminution of their own power. But the broader picture, I think, is that unitary executive is a polite term in this case for a kind of autocracy. And the way that autocracies come into being is by diminishing, defeating, or subjugating all other power centers, independent power centers, in not just in the government, but in civil society as well. So I actually see the president's attack on the legal profession, on the judiciary, on the universities, on the mainstream media as all of a piece. So we see a very vigorous attack on the universities by defunding all research and selectively defunding targeted universities. So the same week that we see the Paul Weiss law firm capitulating to the president, we see Columbia University capitulating to the president. But I see this as part of a larger campaign to undermine independent institutions and liberal institutions more generally. So, I mean, and I think it's been unfolding in a very rational way. The first thing you do is to get control of the government agencies is fire all of the independent inspectors general. Then to get control of the military, fire the chief military lawyers from all the branches of service to be replaced with loyalists, fire the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and replace it with somebody who is believed to be a loyalist, although he denies it. Um, and then go after the press, go after the universities, go after the legal profession, go after the judiciary. So I think to me, that's the broader context. And I'm going to bring in a term from a legal theorist of Germany of the 1930s, a man named Ernst Fraenkel, who wrote a book analyzing the legal system called The Dual State. The dual state was what he calls the normative state, and by that he means the ordinary functioning of legal institutions independently, and the prerogative state, which doesn't completely take over the other system, but it is superimposed on it. The prerogative state means the prerogative of the leader. And the theory of the unitary executive is a kind of fancied up way of saying that the president, that the entire executive branch of government is simply the agent of the leader. Now, this might have made sense in some constitutional sense 150, 180 years ago when the executive branch of government was very small. But when you're talking about something that is enormous, then to say everybody in it has to be coordinated, which is, of course, one of the terms back from the 1930s of coordinating every branch of government in Germany and every civil society organization. That establishes the prerogative state. And so what I think that we are seeing is a kind of testing to see where there's going to be pushback. And I think what we saw this week or past couple of weeks with the attacks on the law firms is to see whether big law, which is enormously rich and enormously powerful, and I would not describe it as angelic in any way, but to see whether that's an independent power center or if it can be subjugated as well. Now, the executive orders have targeted 3 law firms, and then there's a 4th one that came out, I think, yesterday, that is targeting anybody who's litigating against the president. So let me just briefly describe the 3 that were targeted at law firms. These are all law firms that at some point had represented somebody that is the president's personal enemy. And I mean, one of the odd things about these orders is that the pettiness and spite and vengefulness is really not disguised in them. But it's, I think, part of a broader agenda of terrorizing big law into not opposing Trump initiatives. The 4th executive order, the one that came out yesterday, was a directive to the Attorney General that whenever somebody sues the government, the Attorney General should look to try to move to those lawyers sanctioned. Now, sanctioning is what you do when a lawyer is filing a frivolous lawsuit, either because there aren't any facts behind it or because it's a total misrepresentation of the law. And the sanctions usually they involve paying the other side's attorney's fees, but sometimes they can involve other forms of penalties on the law firms. In effect, this is saying, see if you can weaponize this this rule that's designed to keep frivolous stuff out of the courts by using it against anybody who is suing the administration. Because now we just assume that if they're suing us, then they're the ones who are weaponizing the legal system. So that's directed against any litigators, not just these three law firms.
Yeah, I mean, we have in Australia, in the Australian legal profession, a conceptually sort of similar mechanism for disciplining practitioners. Lawyers have to sign off when they commence litigation that it has reasonable prospects of success, and a consistent failure to observe that obligation to bring litigation that doesn't have reasonable prospects of success might be professional misconduct. This is kind of suggesting that litigation against the federal government is tantamount to professional misconduct in and of itself.
Yeah, at least the suspicion of it. And I think that one of the things that's interesting to me is that this president has his tactics when he's opposed. I mean, this has been true always, is not just to fight back, but to fight back by accusing the accuser of the very same accusation. Okay, so one of the things that was really amazing 4 years or 5 years ago when the 2020 election happened and the president said, well, it was stolen, and there were dozens of frivolous lawsuits filed on his behalf. Many of them got sanctioned or thrown out of court. My own personal favorite was a lawsuit that was asking for $1,000 in damages on behalf of every voter in the United States because of the stolen election, which the judge who sanctioned lawyers who brought it said memorably, "This is no ordinary slip and fall case. This is the biggest damage award for in U.S. history, and it's larger than the gross domestic product of Hungary."
In that era of frivolous sort of election litigation, I always recall the urgent application brought complaining of an absence of Republican monitors at a vote counting centre, and the advocate on behalf of the plaintiff being forced to admit that there were a non-zero amount of Republican vote counters in the room, which I thought was a very unwilling admission to the presence of exactly the kind of person that they were complaining wasn't there. The kind of catchword for President Trump's term for the last 8 weeks has been unprecedented. Everything is unprecedented, right? We use this word every day to describe something the Trump administration is doing. But one thing that isn't unprecedented is attacking the legal profession, right? This is an old playbook. I didn't think we'd get through this episode without mentioning Henry VI. So, of course, in Shakespeare's play, we have our famous quote, often maladapted, which is, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." Now, the quote is deployed not because the person speaking it in Shakespeare's work just doesn't like lawyers, but because he's aware that they're often a nuisance or a obstacle to the power of despots. So this is a pretty common strategy throughout history to disable the legal profession from criticising or impeding a authoritarian leader. Something I think I'm really interested to hear from you, David, as someone who studies both sort of moral and legal authority in organisations, is to what extent does this resemble historical attacks on legal professions in other settings?
Well, I think that the fact that so many lawyer jokes exist show that people have always had a lot of impatience with lawyers. I mean, usually you go to a lawyer when you either have some very deeply unpleasant paperwork to deal with, or you've got some kind of a big problem that the lawyer is supposed to dig you out of the hole for. So it's, but the kind of attacks on the legal profession that you're talking about, I think, go back to the ages of absolute monarchy. Uh, and is this unprecedented? I think this is. I mean, what's not unprecedented is an attempt, I'd say mostly by conservatives in the United States over the last 25 or 30 years, to try to take out the adversary lawyers, but usually it's by attacking their funding sources. Um, and try to, for example, do away with legal aid, because legal aid is often oppositional to big interests. But there have been more subtle and technical ways, with manipulating rules for how lawyers get paid in civil rights cases, that are all an attempt to taking out the adversary is the title of a paper that I wrote about this 25 years ago. So that's not new. What's new is the government of the United States and the president of the United States trying to take out the adversary in a very, very direct way.
Can I just follow up on that? I mean, it's not unusual in other places that we would now call authoritarian, right? Like we've seen this in Poland, in somewhat democracy adjacent places. We've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in other places. But it sort of goes towards a chilling effect, which is sort of, I think, to me at least, seems to be the larger goal of all of this. That once you start taking out, as you said, the powerful likes of Paul Weiss, right, one of the most sort of loaded law firms, if you will, that exists, that when they bend their knee and then I guess donate $40 million worth of legal advice to causes of Donald Trump's choosing, that, I mean, that's almost unheard of, or is unheard of, question mark, David?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are very complicated dynamics behind their decision. But let's just call it what it is. It was a shakedown.
Yeah.
I mean, the president threatens them. They donate $40 million worth of legal services. Now, the email that the lead partner of Paul Weiss sent to the lawyers in the firm was, look, these are going to causes that we already support. And he reassures them that we are not going to change the way that we practice law at all. Is that damage control, or is that real? One of the things in his email that I found very depressing was he said, we thought about fighting it. We even had a lawsuit prepared. But when we were hoping that we would get solidarity from other big law firms, instead, they saw it as an opportunity to poach our clients and poach our lawyers. So assuming that that's true, which I've got no reason to doubt, I mean, it shows a kind of shocking lack of strategic sense on the part of the other law firms, who are just hoping to ride out this bump. And meanwhile, behave like rational, self-interested actors. I mean, look, law firms poach each other's clients and lawyers all the time, and as often as they can get away with it, right? So that's not unusual. But the fact that they don't see that there's a need for any kind of collective solidarity around these attacks, I find very discouraging.
I mean, you had that. I mean, I think there's many fights going on, as you said. It's complex, right? One fight is between probably some of the litigators, and at least from the New York Times article that seems to have written that up quite nicely, and which we'll link to in the show notes. That's sort of one fight between the commercial lawyers and the litigators, because the litigator instinct is we litigate, whereas the commercial lawyers were seeing that their clients could no longer be represented with respect to the federal government, because part of the executive orders, and maybe that's good to clarify for our listeners, is you potentially can't enter federal buildings, you can't engage with the federal government, and if you have any business as a client with the federal government, your lawyer has to be able to interact, and that was apparently or threatened to be cut off. and I think that's created some of those dynamics on top of everything that you just said, David. And again, Paul Weiss is not a small place, right? Like I looked this up. Their revenue is 2.63 billion in 2024. They're not a small player. They're one of the largest players in the field globally.
That makes a very attractive target for the president. But this is earlier today. I heard a talk about what are some of the dynamics of the firm. And Paul Weiss doubled its partnership take per year in the last decade, so that now its profits per partner are $7.5 million, which is close to 12 million Australian dollars per partner. But a lot of that, almost all of that growth comes from the corporate sector, not the litigation sector. And a lot of the profits in the corporate sector come from a handful of Paul Weiss partners who have $50 to $75 million books of business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's entirely possible that the crisis that the firm faced was just from a handful of partners with big books of business who say, if you don't make this go away, we walk.
Yeah, that's interesting. That there is always kind of that internal politics within a partnership that looks so different to a corporate model. You have the owner manager and kind of the owner manager en masse, which is always sort of fertile ground for division, I guess, and discord.
Well, let me say something about a little bit. I mean, another development was that there's been a law firm associates letter circulating that. I mean, it's sort of discouraging that the associates have to hide their names. So they just give the name of their firm in the a year, which I assume is the year that they joined the firm. But as of late this afternoon, 1,500 law firm associates had signed. So from the point of view of the younger lawyers, this kind of caving in and this lack of pushback is ruinous for the kind of profession that they think that they were, or that they signed up for. Right. Rachel Cohen was a single lawyer at the big firm of Staten Arps who wrote a letter to the partnership saying, consider a time-dated letter of resignation because you're not standing up. And I'm talking about a circular letter from associates at dozens of big firms. 1,500, almost. So there is some effort to push back. Now, Perkins Coie was the firm who were having their lawyer, part of the executive order was to bar their lawyers from federal buildings, which would actually be unconstitutional because that means that they can't represent their clients in courts because the courthouses are federal buildings. But I mean, there are many things that are unconstitutional about these orders, maybe 10 or 15 different things that are unconstitutional about them. And I don't think that they'll stand up, but I don't think the point of them was to stand up. Perkins Coie did fight back. They sued. The hearing was amazing. They were represented by another law firm that does mostly litigation, a Washington, D.C. law firm called Williams and Connolly. At one point in the hearing, the judge asked the government lawyer, could Williams and Connolly be punished for representing Perkins Coie? And the government lawyer's answer was, oh, yes, if it's in the national interest to do so. At which point the judge said, oh, this is like the Queen of Hearts running around shouting off with their heads.
I mean, this is extraordinary, right? So, look, when I started studying law, there was sort of a basement in which there was all these sort of what I would call 3D wallpaper, the law reports, right? And had some sort of reverence for the U.S. legal system. But to me, that is sort of when I read that particular statement, that you, the firm that has been, that is choosing to represent another firm, Perkins Coie, and so Williams Connolly represents them, all of a sudden is themselves threatened. And I think the irony is not lost that both Kavanaugh and Kagan used to work for Williams and Connolly at some point in time, right? So this is sort of one of these things that might come back at some point if it ever goes up to the Supreme Court. But I think your point, David, is the point is not whether it's constitutional or not. It's the naked assertion of power. No.
It's the naked assertion of power and the in terrorem, the terrorizing effect, right? It's
Yeah.
that every big law firm is having internal meetings constantly about how we're going to deal with this, and I think that the fact that there hasn't been this kind of solidarity among the big law firms is so short-sighted on their part, because it's not as if they obey in advance that they can guarantee that the administration won't come after them for representing some client that gets crosswise with the administration. So there's an illusion of safety there.
One thing that strikes me about our conversation about both who are the targets of these reprisals and who is speaking up or not about them is the absence of professional bodies. We're talking about which law firm takes a stand or which doesn't, which individual lawyers take a stand and who doesn't. But again, thinking about how our profession in Australia works, we have law societies and law institutes in each state, and we also have representative bodies at a Commonwealth level who are there to represent the interests of their members, who do policy work, who lobby the government, who are meant to be our kind of representatives writ large, separated from the commercial interest, right? The Law Society doesn't, care about the partner M at any one law firm. They care about the interests of the profession as a whole, and you might say about the administration of justice and the rule of law. So, where's the ABA? Where are the state bar associations? Kind of, what role should they be playing if they're not playing one?
Well, I actually don't know about the state bar associations. The ABA has issued two pretty strong statements, and all that happened was that the administration said, "Oh yeah, the radical leftist ABA has been captured." That is very predictable, and we're not going to listen to them anymore. And at least one government agency then sent out an order that anybody who belongs to the ABA, who working in the agency, can't attend any ABA events. So the retaliation, is kind of the two trademarks. It's instantaneous and it's very petty, but it also does things that matter. The American legal profession doesn't have a trade association as such. I mean, the ABA is a voluntary club of lawyers, basically. Um, if it had a trade association, you might be able to sue on behalf of the firms, but there is no such entity.
I guess the point is that these organizations, representative bodies, they have a kind of belief-based power, or a kind of soft power that really only works if they command the respect or influence of the administration that they're trying to influence. And I suppose many presidents, many federal government officials have some tie, historical or present, to the legal profession, and maybe that's how bar associations can move the needle in the past, but clearly there is just no level of soft power, no level of influence that the ABA has within the Trump White House.
Yeah, well, and I think that probably for a lot of people who aren't lawyers and who are sympathetic to Trump, their reaction is, well, look, we won the election, and these people are just standing in the way of the majority will out of the way. Now, this is something that I think about a lot is to most people, what does the rule of law mean? I mean, it's a phrase,
Yeah.
right? But if you make it concrete, it's traffic tickets, um, unpleasant and sometimes very dangerous encounters with the police. It's paperwork. Uh, it's having to pay exorbitant legal fees when you buy an apartment or a house. I mean, it's everything. It's just a bundle of unpleasant experiences. So, uh, what I keep on thinking about is that the other half of the rule of law is the rule of law, not of men. And so the
Yeah.
really means is, I mean, do you want to be the vassal of somebody who is the boss? Uh, don't you like freedom? I mean, because freedom is not being under the rule of Donald Trump.
I agree, David. I think about the rule of law a lot, and what it means to us as legal professionals is a little skewed. You know, we're priests of a secular religion, right? That hold the rule of law, in the highest regard. But you're right; most people don't, list it off in their most treasured values or the things they love most about the society and the community in which they live and work. I wonder, how many believers are in the flock for this secular religion sometimes. But maybe we need to do a better job of describing the other side of that coin, right? That the rule of law is about the exclusion of the worse alternative rather than, as you say, stamp duty and parking tickets.
Yeah.
I mean, this goes to, I think, the heart of David's work that I didn't work on in some sense. I did sort of the other stuff, the international criminal law stuff, when David and I were at Stanford. But this notion of do lawyers have to have some kind of baseline ethical standards in which they operate, right? And I think David worked on this in the Bush administration, the first Trump administration, and now. So unfortunately, having to make clear this abstract version of, or the value of this abstract version of rule of law and not of man is really difficult to convey, right? So whenever people like myself get called in to do some interview on radio or TV or something, right? Trying to get that point across that I find to be almost at the heart of everything is really difficult. Part of which is the reason why we have this podcast, because we wanted to get into the sort of the deeper meat of these conversations, because they start to matter, but it's really hard to get them across. David, so how do we get there? Like apart from us having a conversation and hopefully many people listening to it.
Yeah. Well, a lifetime academic is probably the wrong person to ask about how to get. But I do think that talking about the connection between the rule of law and freedoms that we take for granted is very important. And I mean, that might be a message that many people could connect with. If you see what the flip side of the paperwork is. The paperwork is a way of regularizing something that otherwise it might be like, I remember I had a Russian neighbor who, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, went back to try to sell her apartment in Moscow. And, there wasn't a lot of paperwork. There was just a lot of bribery and corruption and, show up with a paper full of cash. Um, is that the way you want things to be run?
I mean, we spoke with Steve Vladek a couple of weeks ago, and when we did, we tried to sort of diagnose how close to constitutional crisis are we, and at that time, we said, well, there's no kind of overt refusal to obey a court order. There's no direct attack on the judiciary. I mean, that kind of assurance has aged like milk. We're now talking about those things just 2 weeks later. It feels like there's a pretty overt attack on the rule of law right now, but I'm kind of at a loss of what can be done about it. We've canvassed that The professional associations don't really have any influence in the room. Large law firms have complicated commercial interests that they'll perhaps understandably place first, given the pressures within their partnerships. What can be done about this? Is it just weather the storm until the polls start to persuade someone to turn it down? I mean, what happens next?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that first there has to be an understanding in other sectors of society, the legal profession, but not only the legal profession, about the danger that they're in. And then they have to grow, get a backbone, and push back against it. So here's an example from a different sector. A colleague of mine was a friend was a high-level senior researcher in a big tech firm, and said that after the Trump administration cut research grants for basic science and for all science, the tech giant executives got together, talked about maybe running a full-page ad in the newspaper saying, "We support science," something really harmless and anodyne like that, but they chickened out. We don't want to get, that would just put us, so, my God, if tech billionaires can't run a simple ad on behalf of science, it means that they are, once again, to use a term that the historian Tim Snyder has, anticipatory obedience, obeying orders in advance. So don't obey orders in advance. Be very steely-eyed in understanding that this is not just something that's going to blow over, because what we're seeing is an early attempt to just see, well, how far can we push without any pushback? And if nobody pushes back, then it goes further and further. So that's it. Push back. Don't give in. I think this ends up being very complicated because a single individual can say, "Fine, I am not giving in," but what happens if this comes back and bites all of my colleagues? So if as a professor, something that ends up getting grant money taken away from my university, I'm hurting a lot of my colleagues. If a partner in a law firm says we are pushing back against this, and the firm ends up in economic trouble because of it, well, there might be hundreds or even thousands of jobs at stake. So this is a kind of morally complex decision, but I think that it's really essential to push back.
I mean, this is the argument, and again, a number of German terms come to mind, David, when you were speaking. Anticipatory obedience is almost exactly a translation of a German term that also is associated with 1930s and 1940s Germany, right? And I've used that particular term for a few years now, even before Timothy Snyder used it.
Yeah, for Ausländer, it sounds so much better in German.
Yes, it sounds fantastic in German. There's also another one that comes into mind, which is Kadavergehorsam, right? Which is also this obedience in packs, which is exactly what the issue that you just described. And I think Brad Karp, the head of Paul Weiss, used exactly that argumentation in his emails, basically saying, well, this is something we have to do because otherwise even our firm would go under. I'd like to end on a lighter note, but we really can't, because I actually wanted to come back for the end, right, to something you said at the very beginning, which is about universities. And that is really sort of this extreme pressure that universities are coming under. And we've seen this with Columbia University already. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago with Steve, but your own deans received a letter from the interim U.S. attorney for D.C., basically telling you, well, we're not going to hire your, again, sort of trying to get at the economics of it, right? We're not going to hire your graduates, and therefore, William Trenor wrote a really, really good response. But I mean, we see major funding cuts being threatened and already happening, potentially because a Trump
Yeah.
business deal or real estate deal didn't happen a few years ago. Increased taxation on university endowments, reduced staff at the education department or getting rid of it entirely. USAID cutting millions in research grants, specific universities being targeted, like I said, Columbia for allegations of anti-Semitism on campus or of how anti-Semitism on campus was dealt with. Again, another chilling effect of a part of society that would probably that is not in Trump's camp by default. Where is that going, David? That to me again is one of those really frightening aspects. And I'm not saying this because I'm a hardcore liberal. It's just maybe because I'm a university professor. But universities are there to also speak out against power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, where's it going? I mean, what's the old saying? I can predict everything except the future. Well, let's go back to what you just mentioned. The interim U.S. attorney, whose chief claim to fame that made him the U.S. attorney was that he was orchestrating Trump's Stop the Steal campaign after the 2020 election. And he sends a letter to our dean saying, "We won't give your students internships or jobs until you assure us that all traces of diversity, equity, inclusiveness, DEI, have been eradicated from your curriculum." And the dean wrote back, I thought, a very powerful letter saying, "You can't tell us what goes in the curriculum." And
Mm-hmm.
uh, and it was Georgetown is a Catholic university. It's a Jesuit school, and he said, you are not only infringing against our free speech rights, but we have a mission of inclusiveness as a Jesuit and Catholic institution. So I think there is a freedom of religion claim incipient there. I don't know what the upshot of that would be. I mean, when I've been sort of thinking about it, um, would we have standing to sue if our students are being denied internships? Probably not, but they might. But are they going to? I don't know. So
Mm-hmm.
what we're coming back to is that the main tool that we have right now is litigation. And the litigation might end up being successful. I mean, there have been a lot of the Trump executive orders that have been blocked by judges. Who knows what the upshot of all of these cases will be? But um, we don't know who's going to sue, who's going to think that it's not worth it. I certainly applauded our dean for, I thought, a very courageous and forthright letter. Um, and I haven't, I wish I could see some other university. I mean, I would have liked to see a letter of solidarity from other law school deans, which didn't happen. I'm assuming that Bill Traynor got a lot of phone calls from other deans saying, congratulations on writing your letter. But I haven't seen what I would have liked, which is the 150 law school deans all signing a letter saying that they agree with Bill Traynor.
So that's an unhappy note to almost end on, David. Dave, do you have any more questions for David?
I'm conscious that we have been, I guess, like everyone, not fantastic at predicting 2 weeks into the future on this show. Our conversation with Steve Vladek maybe assumed that things wouldn't turn out the way they have over the last 14 days. If you were going to make any predictions about the next 14 days, David, what would they be?
I don't know what the litigation case from the law firms asking the Perkins Coie case is what's going to happen there. Some of the other executive order cases, I think that if the institutions hold and a lot of the blatantly illegal and unconstitutional stuff gets smacked down, then that will be sending a signal that you tried to push as far as you could and you couldn't push that far. And I could see that happening, but litigation is slow, so that might not happen for months, right? And in the meantime, I assume that there will be more steps taken by the administration. There will be more lawsuits opposing those steps. There'll be more restraining orders saying to the administration, you can't do that, with an occasional judge saying, oh, yes, you can do that, but mostly saying not. And then that's, so, kind of welcome to the circus for the next, I think that the trapeze artists are still flinging each other around for the next 2 weeks is my prediction.
Well, that's a happier note to end on, potentially.
It's at least a happier image to end on. I don't know if the implications are any happier.
Yeah, it depends on whether the trapeze artist is being caught or not, right? David, can I just thank you for doing this? I really, really appreciate it. I wish we could see each other more often, but it's been a great pleasure to have you on the podcast, and hopefully at some other point under better circumstances.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was really nice to see you again, talk, and Dave, it's really nice to meet you. Yeah.
You as well. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation with David. It is hard to end on a lighter note with these sorts of stories. It feels like every light note kind of brings you back around to something a little concerning, which I guess we're right to be concerned. But let's try to finish the show on a light note, Markus. We've got some viewing and reading recommendations for our listeners. Markus, you've got a movie this year. Markus, you've got a movie this
well,
week.
I have a movie, but before I get to that, I couldn't overlook the fact that Panama beat the U.S. in football, and if it isn't clear what I mean soccer, in the Nations League.
I was going to say, when you said football, I was surprised to hear that Panama and the United States had an AFL team. So that's
NRL, AFL, whatever, NFL, whatever you want it to be. None of these are football. I mean the actual football as played in Europe and Latin America. So in the CONCACAF Nations League, in the 4th minute of stoppage time in a game between the U.S. and Panama scores the winning goal. It's the 3rd victory in a row for Panama against the U.S., so it's not completely new. But given the threats against Panama by the Trump administration over the Panama Canal, I thought that was sort of a fitting element to sneak in. The recommendation I have this time is a movie called The City of God, also based on a movie, on a book by the same title. And it came about because I had a conversation with a few friends as to what one of the best movies was that we'd ever watched. And to my mind, City of God is one of those movies. There's a sequel of a TV series which gets mixed reviews, and I don't think it comes even close. But The City of God is this really impactful film, to my mind, that looks at the very brutal and compelling stories of life in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. And I've lived briefly in Brazil, so I can relate a little bit. My former partner is Brazilian. And it's based, like I said, on this 1997 novel by Paulo Lins, which is rooted in real events and the author's own experiences in the City of God slum in Rio. And the movie really traces the lives of 2 boys, Rocket and Little Z, navigating through a world of crime from a very, very small age. And as they grow up, they live through corruption, survival, and it's vivid cinematography, powerful performances, really well scripted, well shot, and looks at the very harsh realities of poverty, gang violence, the sense of hopelessness that often traps the residents of these favelas, but also showing the strength and resilience of its characters. There's people living there that no one deserves to live in these circumstances. Sometimes that happens there. And what I find really remarkable is that it doesn't just tell a story. It is really looks at this complex and often devastating world, and choices there sometimes mean life and death. The book, like I said, the movie is based on a novel. Similarly worth reading, and so I recommend wholeheartedly City of God. If someone asked me, is it the best movie ever, I think it's getting pretty close.
Wow, that is a glowing recommendation. Where can you see it?
It depends on where you live. Again, in our bifurcated or multi-forcated world, it depends on where you live. I think you can rent it in Australia. You can rent it on YouTube or some other, or might have been on Netflix some time ago. It just depends on where you are.
Well, it sounds amazing. I'll have to give it a go. Do you recommend reading the book first? Is it one of those movies where you get something out of consuming the literature first?
Look, I first watched the movie and then subsequently read the book. I think if you don't have the time, if you can't invest the time to read the book, then at least watch the movie. It's 2 hours extremely well spent.
You know, just to tie it back to our conversation with David before, I guess it tells a story of a place where the rule of law is totally absent, right?
Yes. Well, it's a different type of law, right? It's a very different type of law, but one that most people, I think, would not be comfortable to live in.
Yeah, that's right. It's the law of organized crime and kind of the man with the big stick, right? It's a warning of kind of the final result of rule of law completely breaking down and its total absence, which is very different to a kind of coordinated authoritarian state. But I guess a useful thing to think about, given our conversation about how often we take for granted what the rule of law means in our developed economies.
Both of them are frightening. Let's be realistic. And again, we might be accused as lawyers or law professors to sort of stick maybe too slavishly to some processes at times. But I do think that processes oftentimes are a good thing. But over to you now. You have a recommendation that follows on from what you talked about last time.
Yes. So last time on the show, I talked about Ted Chiang's series of essays about artificial intelligence and especially generative AI in The New Yorker. Just in the last couple of weeks, a joint paper published by researchers at Microsoft and Carnegie Mellon University. The paper is titled "The Impact of Generative AI on Critical Thinking." This paper, just published this month, suggests that there is an inverse correlation between your confidence in generative AI and the critical thinking that you do when you use it. So there's some really alarming kind of findings, or maybe interesting findings, depending on how deeply you think about them, how much critical thinking you do when you read the paper, maybe. The researchers found that there was a inverse correlation, as I said, between confidence in generative AI and critical thinking, that the type of critical thinking shifted a great deal. So the most worrying shift I read about was that knowledge workers shift from problem solving to response integration. So critical thinking about how to fit the AI output into the final product rather than thinking about the problem itself. That generative AI can result in mechanized convergence, which is the term that the researchers coined for this idea that users of generative AI tools kind of produce a statistical mean of outputs, which makes sense. Large language models are probabilistic models. They're next token predictors. It makes sense that their recommendations kind of all converge around a statistically plausible point. And then that there's a potential long-term harm to critical thinking more broadly as you inhibit your critical engagement with work. And it's that last point that I thought was really interesting in the paper, because in circles that I move in as a software developer, in legal technology circles, in technology circles more broadly, there's this sort of rallying cry or kind of cliche that we talk about now that, well, you know, what AI is there to do is to take all the boring, low-stakes stuff off your plate so that you can focus on higher value, more important work. And I have to say, even when I am talking about my company, Lext's own AI tools, I use a similar argument that, you know, reviewing the 13th trust deed after you've reviewed 12 isn't teaching you anything. You can automate that process once you know what you're looking for. But the paper suggests that there's actually a real risk to thinking about our low-stakes work in this way, that if we don't do enough of that sort of higher volume cognitive work, we don't actually have enough cognitive exercise to do to keep those skills honed. We kind of possibly lose our ability to perform the high-stakes problem-solving work if we're not regularly exercising our brains doing that work regularly, even on low-stakes things. So really interesting paper. I won't go into too much more of it. I wrote more of a breakdown of the paper and of some of the other research on the impact of critical thinking and cognitive offloading over the last couple of months on my Substack, which is called 2 Codes, those codes being the law and software. You can read that on Substack. We'll leave a link in the show notes.
Sounds fascinating. Sounds almost like a bit of a follow-up also to Law is Code, right? The old book that everyone in that space has probably read by Lawrence Lessig. Which he wrote 20 years ago now or something, maybe even before that. But I mean, from an academic's perspective, I think that is probably what we're seeing, that students these days do not, and probably we were no different, right? If you wanted to read, if you were asked to redo things that you thought you were able to do, you were just trying to do shortcuts, and that's the real problem. But it also, I think, the papers. To me, the other bit that was really instructive was that for the good students, there will always be space to work in, right? And for good graduates, there's always space to work in. And I think that's what one of the major takeaways, at least for me, was from that paper. It's a very small sample size. That's the one thing I think the authors. And we should point out, it's a very small sample size, but it's a really, really interesting paper. We'll link to it in the show notes. I don't know that we have a happy note to end on, David. That seems to be the doom and gloom of our time. But we do hope that the conversation with David Luban was interesting. I've certainly learned a lot from him. I always learned a lot from him. He doesn't know this. I didn't tell him that during the interview. But he, to me, is one of the 3 legal giants in the world that I've met in my lifetime. And so it was a very, very nice way to interact with him again. But I think we'll leave it there, and we'll come back in a couple of weeks, and we'll probably talk about the Australian elections and maybe something having to do with tariffs, because in about a week or so, the Trump administration has announced that they will, on the 2nd of April, provide reciprocal tariffs, whatever that may mean in practice. Who knows?
Absolutely. Join us for more doom and gloom next time on the Civic Podcast.
Take care. Have a good week.
Thanks, Markus.
The Civic Podcast is presented by David Turner and myself, Markus Wagner. Help us spread the word by telling others about the podcast. For more information, visit us on thecivicpodcast.com. Our handle on the socials is The Civic Podcast. The production team consists of Irene Bijou, Justin Bortignon, Jacqueline Malafe, and Jacob Malby. On behalf of David Turner and myself, thank you for listening.